Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, how exactly does one cleanse themselves of this Bears performance from their mind? Does it have to go full eternal sunshine, or how does that work?
Well, I'm fine because every moment that the Bears screw up is a moment that validates my article, which got like 70 odd comments. Man, Bears fans, I don't know why, but they seem to hate it.
I have no idea why a Bears fan would be upset at their team being called a paper tiger, and then it actually happening on national TV. God, it's
very weird.
It sucks. It's almost like when everyone said last year that this was the worst, number 2 seed in the history of the NFL playoffs for the Packers, and then the Packers getting blown out by a far superior 49ers team, and then being like, I don't know what could have been done to prevent this. Oh, how about everyone?
How could you have predicted this happening?
Yeah.
Who knew?
Who knew? Except sometimes it's not that the pundits are asses. Sometimes they are actually right on this, and you're just choosing to ignore them, as opposed to the Vikings fans who just already know that death and terror and, let's say, a major trade is just right around the corner. And with that, we would like to welcome you to this episode of Norse Code. You will notice that this episode title is the exact same as it was 13 episodes ago. That is not a mistake. We are here to talk about the Yannick and Ngakoue trade. Wow. That's something, and we will get to that in just a moment, along with discussions on surgery, fire sales, and a pretty good mailbag. But before we do, just want to thank you guys so much for listening to Norse Code, for telling your friends about it, for telling your family about it, for telling a coworker you don't like about it. Whatever you do to spread the word about Norse Code, we appreciate it. And we especially appreciate those who are signing up on Patreon. Again, if you are interested in receiving swag from us starting December 1st, you can go over to patreon.com/NorseCode. You can donate $3.50 a month, Tree Fitty, to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. And that will ensure not only that you get the bonus episodes that we put up every week, but it also ensures that you will get some free swag if you just message me afterwards and say, yes, I would in fact like some free swag. Those of you who have messaged me already, I appreciate it. I will be responding to you guys probably today or tomorrow to get a couple of details and make sure that everything's OBKB on that. So, but again, if you would like to get swag from us this holiday season, you can do so at patreon.com/NorseCode. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well if you would like to access the bonus episodes, and you can donate. That's more of a one-time donation. If you would like to access the bonus material, however, that is, I believe, $42.99, 98 cents, $41.98, somewhere in there. I'm just not doing the math at the moment. My brain feels stopped a bit by watching Nick Foles attempt to, well, actually not even Nick Foles really, after watching the Bears offensive line and the Bears offensive coordinator try to run directly at Aaron Donald on a
they must have been told by they must have been told by ESPN Analytics that it was a good idea.
You just why would you do it? It has nothing to do with him being the best defender in the league. It has everything to do with you being a complete idiot. Like, whatever. Anyway, patreon.com/NorseCode or paypal.me/NorseCode. Again, if you would like to access the bonus material and potentially get some free swag out of it. So, again, thank you guys so much. I want to thank 3 people in particular, Cody Knuth, or Knuth, I'm assuming it's Knuth, Ethan Frost, and Kevin Pedersen. Thank you guys so much for signing up. We do, again, very much appreciate it. This sort of thing helps us keep the lights on, helps us keep the shows going twice a week during the regular season, helps with things like if we need to get new equipment, microphones, or if we have some unexpected expense with, say, working on merchandise stuff or something like that. And it also helps with giveaways. So if you are interested in such a thing, again, patreon.com/NorseCode. All right, let's get all of that out of the way. The first thing we should talk about is the trade. And we had talked earlier this season especially when things started to go a bit south, about the potential parallels this season could possibly have to 2010, or what would be the most 2010 thing to happen to the 2020 Vikings. And I'm not literally comparing the play of Randy Moss to Yannick Ngakoue. I'm not doing that. What I am saying is it's pretty goddamn hilarious that after X number of games, he's no longer a Viking.
I will say that they are not comparable because Ngakoue was playing better. So
much, and he wasn't, and he also wasn't yelling at catering over the type of meat that was there. I forget if it was roast beef or it was something else, but it's not that he left in a huff. It's just that the star player that was traded for is also gone pretty quickly after he came.
Yeah, no, it's pretty exciting, isn't it?
Do you remember when we were talking about the possibility of him and Danielle Hunter starting on the same defensive line and the terror that was going to appear in the NFC North quarterback's eyes when both of them were staring him down? How that was going to be a thing, and that people were going to actually have to deal with the idea of we could ignore how terrible the corners were going to be because they were going to get pressure. And so they weren't going to be able to like hit deep dive or hit deep bombs or anything. It wasn't going to matter there because we were going to be able to get pressure, and they were going to be able to like sack the quarterback or at least cause them to have a short pocket, like a very, very small amount of time in the pocket, and nothing could possibly develop because you had all this pressure up front. Remember that 8 weeks ago, 9 weeks ago? Was it even that? I don't even know anymore.
Yeah, it must have been 8 weeks ago. No, yeah, I remember because we assumed that Danielle Hunter was going to end up playing, and the thing is actually, so the more time passes, the more I'm moving back on the other direction. Did the Vikings know that Danielle Hunter was not going to be ready to play this season? It does seem like the Vikings actually thought that Hunter would be ready to play at some point this season when they made the trade, kind of just based off of reporting that's happening in the background, the way that Spielman has talked about it, the way Zimmer has talked about it. I think the realization that it was a herniated disc, which can sometimes just present as generalized pain, and when it doesn't go away, that's when you end up getting the MRI. The realization that the herniated disc was a herniated disc and would require either a significant amount of time or surgery. They didn't know that was the case when they traded for him, apparently. So I guess that's the context. And so the original take that, they wouldn't have done this if they didn't expect Hunter kind of works out then, because now that they know Hunter, because remember, this occurred within like hours of each other, right? Now that they know that Hunter's not going to be available for the season, they've just decided to punt on the asset, which they essentially dropped like 50 spots in the draft in order to get 6 games of Yannick Ngakoue, which is probably not worth it, given that those 6 games were not remarkable. I thought that he was playing a little bit better than PFF was saying, but like we're not like remarkable, right? Like that's not worth 6 games. Or that's not worth, dropping 50 spots from probably the top of the second or the area at the top of the second.
No, that's
to probably the bottom-ish of the third.
It's kind of disheartening. And, Matthew Collar had an excellent article out last week about how it's an example of the Vikings always paying the highest possible price for free agents like that, or for in trades like this. And it's certainly not the first time that something like this has happened, and the fact that it caused a drop in picks so significant, it just seems like especially after reading the Collar article, business as usual.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, because the article came out a bit ago. I'm trying to remember the examples, but the one that comes to my mind, obviously, is again the Moss one, where you didn't even get the picks back, right? Because they waived Moss. So it's a 3rd round pick. You get a couple of games out of him, and then he's gone. But yeah, I mean, when they make the trades, they do them at the worst possible times. Sometimes you can't blame them, right? Because sometimes it's like Sam Bradford, right? They made the trade when the price was at its highest, right? right before the season when, the Vikings obviously didn't have a plan, when the Eagles wouldn't have had a plan to have a backup quarterback able to replace Carson Wentz when he got hurt. It was the highest possible price you could possibly pay, right? And it just kind of happens again and again. So yeah, it's it's a pattern that the Vikings have made, and sometimes you can't even blame them for like fitting the pattern.
Annoying is one word for it. And a lot of talk this week, or over the past week rather, has been about how is this the first asset to go. I mean, it has been stated that this really could be the canary in the coal mine for the team doing a full reset, which Spielman has said flat out this isn't what they're doing. Although Spielman also said that he doesn't believe anyone has lost faith in Kirk Cousins. I don't think those were in the same breath, but it might have been in the same interview.
Yeah, it was in the same presser. Yeah. Yeah, well, so it was interesting because Spielman said, hey, are you rebuilding? And Spielman said, well, when you've got the receivers that you've got, when you've got the tight end room that you have, when you've got, the best, if not one of the best running backs in the NFL in Dalvin Cook, I don't know how you can possibly say you're rebuilding, which is silly, but also funny because he doesn't mention the quarterback. And so then later you ask the question about Kirk Cousins, and then he goes, yeah, no one's lost faith in Kirk Cousins. And if that were the case, I feel like he would naturally come to mind in this conversation about whether or not you're rebuilding, right? Like if you're naming how talented your roster is and you don't name the quarterback off the top of your head, that's pretty rough, right? Like you're not like that doesn't help you.
You see your buddy for the first time in like 6-9 months, like, hey, how's it going? And he tells you all about his kids, how work's going and everything, and he doesn't mention his wife a single time. And you go, so what about your wife? Oh, yeah, she's, it's,
great.
It couldn't be better. And you're just left there, with a slight turn to your head. Like, really? Is that where we're at?
Yeah. Well, I thought we were closer friends than that, but okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, like, because the issue here is that you want to get straight answers from Spielman, who is like known for not giving particularly straight answers, even when you compare him to NFL GMs at large. But then also, he's trying to preserve as much trade value as he possibly can for any player that he has. So you can't say he's, in rebuilding mode, right? Because that signals that, all those players are up for sale. And if it signals that they're up for sale, you sell them at sale prices, essentially. Like if you don't say that the demand is one higher, which is to say we also want to keep this player, if you don't signal that, that you want to keep the player and then therefore would raise the price, that there's an additional buyer in the market and it's you, then you can't, then you've lost a little bit of leverage. So, if there's two competitors bidding for the services of, say, Adam Thielen, which is one name that's been thrown around, then, that'll create a particular price. But when there's another competitor in the market and it's you've got a floor that you can say, hey, look, we've got another person in the market. They want X price, and you're not beating that, so we can't do that. But also, it doesn't matter what that other person wants because that's too low too, because we're just going to keep them, right? If you're not automatically selling them, then and again, Thielen is just an example, then you're reducing the price. So if you say that if you're in a rebuild, then everybody kind of over the age of 28 is basically on sale for you at some point, right? Like obviously there are reasons to kind of keep 30-year-olds. And I'm writing a piece right now about, why it might make sense to keep Adam Thielen and Harrison Smith. But, there are reasons, right? Even in a rebuild scenario. But those reasons are a lot weaker in a situation where you don't have the ability to win right now because, how long is their window going to be? So you have to say it. And I kind of understand that that's kind of where he's coming from in terms of the way that he needs to interact with the media. But it doesn't seem very credulous, of course, right? Like it's just, yeah, man, you traded a second round pick for a piece and then you traded them away for a third and a fifth, a conditional fifth, I guess. That doesn't seem particularly we're all in. Like, of course it doesn't. There's no way it could. So I think the Vikings have essentially, kind of put the brakes on the season. And there's other conversations to be had about it, like, hey, does this signal that the ownership has told the staff that will stick kind of behind you regardless of what the outcome of the season is, because that would make it a lot easier to rebuild. It'd be a lot easier to move assets if ownership tells you, it kind of doesn't matter how many wins you get this year. It puts a lot of pressure on you to get your next set of picks right, and you've only got 1 or 2 more years. But I think that was going to happen either way. So it could be a signal that that's the case, that they're kind of punting on the season. And if they're punting on the season, that means that at least somebody, probably Spielman, was given some assurance that he wouldn't have to worry that much about the season. So that's, I would think, a good sign, right? Because it does mean that you've got the ability to invest in the future without having to worry too much about the present. But yeah, that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is that, how weird is it going to be if Ngakoue blows up, right? Like, 'cause if he does really well in Baltimore, which is entirely possible because they love blitzing. They're the blitz happiest team of the last 2 years. In fact, they were the most blitz happy team last year, and then their second most blitz happy team this year behind Pittsburgh. And they do it in different ways, but when you've got Calais Campbell, who obviously Ngakoue is familiar with, you've got a great group of blitzing linebackers like Patrick Queen and forget the name of the other linebacker at the moment. And you've got an edge rusher, Matthew Judon, and you've got even blitzing corners like Marcus Peters and Jimmy Smith. You've got, the capability of just kind of appearing anywhere and producing pressure from anywhere. And that's going to just make things easier when you're constantly in, man protection, or you constantly know kind of what the protection is going to look like because you're constantly threatening to blitz, and your blitzes are sound. So he could very well blow up. He could have a bunch of pressures and sacks next year, or this for the next, several games. And it's going to look like the Vikings might have made a mistake or traded him for way too cheap. But, the reality is it's very likely that, the environment that the Vikings are in is just not going to be good enough for him to be able to produce. And, the other end of that is that it does make it easier, right, to potentially re-sign him. But I think that he would want to leave and sign somewhere else if that was the case, kind of like Sheldon Richardson did. So yeah, those are all elements to think about when it comes to the Ngakoue trade. But I think the interpretation from most people that this is a sign that the Vikings are in rebuild mode, I think is accurate, despite what the Vikings say.
It's difficult to listen to a team or have a team feel like it has given up by week 7?
Yeah, but I mean, like, other teams clearly have, right? The Texans fired their coach / GM. The Falcons fired their coach and GM. So, yeah,
it is comforting to see the Falcons bounce back from their winning ways to go right back to losing again. It did make me feel good to watch the Todd Gurley situation happen and listen to Bomani Jones the next day being like, "You're telling me that." The kick that would have been easy to make wouldn't have donked off the field goal post like 4 times and like exploded into fire right before it hit the ground. Like, no, this is the Falcons are always going to Falcon. This is just what they do. So the fact that they were able to pull it together one time against the Vikings is par for the course, just enough to give you a little bit of hope. But yeah,
it is funny that the one game was the Vikings game.
I don't know if funny is the right word for it, but it
things could be both funny and painful.
Well, I mean, that's if
it's kind of the ethos of the show, right?
If I didn't already have a show title, there we go. Yeah, it's difficult, but Ngakoue is now going to be a Raven. Good for him. I'm sure the 4 sacks that he had in 6 games were just holding the Vikings back. This is
a lot of the sacks were like coverage sacks, right? It's not as if somebody else might not have been able to do it. Again, I think he was actually playing pretty well, but yeah, that's the argument that a lot of people are making. So hey, there were coverage sacks, which okay, fair enough. But
I mean, if that's what you need to tell yourself to get to sleep at night, great. More power to you. But he was somebody that was getting a lot of work and was doing fairly well on the defensive line, and a defense that is incredibly unremarkable at the moment. And if we're going to talk about the defense, we can talk a bit about the surgery, which is now expected to take Danielle Hunter out for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I think by week 5, well, you can probably go back and listen to whatever show we talk about Danielle Hunter, but which probably occurs every other week or something. But by week 5, I think we were pretty committed to the idea that he was just done. When he, it was around week 6 or 7, he appeared in New York, was apparently getting a second opinion from a doctor there, which that one was kind of difficult to figure out because a bunch of people were like, hey, Arif, his Instagram says that he's in New York. What does that mean? Is he getting a second opinion? Which whoever DM'd me that nailed it. Good job. But I was like, well, his grandmother lives in New York, so maybe he's just like visiting. I have no idea. I don't want to say anything definitively one way or the other. So who knows? It turns out, yeah, you nailed it. He was getting a second opinion. So the first opinion was that he should sit out for the rest of the season. And the second opinion was that he should sit out for the rest of the season. It was a herniated disc, and from what I'm told, so now we're into the realm of my non-medical background research being applied onto a podcast where I'm not held accountable. So, which I don't know. That's been the season for that, right? But
as it turns out,
right. So from my understanding, a herniated disc can sometimes just present as an annoying pain, all the way up to a significant pain, all the way up to just excruciating, insane amounts of pain. So that level of pain that Hunter is experiencing was apparently consistent with a tweak, which is why Zimmer would use that. And so in theory, right? Like, I don't know specifically the level of pain that Hunter was feeling early on. And so, which is why you wouldn't necessarily get an MRI right away. But the problem is, and I think, so Chad Graff at The Athletic wrote a little bit about this too. Zach Parisi, is that, I don't know anything about hockey.
Yes, Zach Parisi, former UND hockey player turned,
he's my favorite then.
Yeah.
Go Fighting Hawks.
Well, I mean, he wasn't a Hawk, but yes, he's now.
You can't say the other word, James.
Well, now he's. Does this always come back to some thing about race and?
Did we win the WCHA that year? Is it still the WCHA? I'm lost.
It's not the WCHA anymore.
Okay, no longer interested.
When the Gophers decided to join, I forget if it was the Big Ten or something else, the WCHA essentially collapsed, and the teams that were in the WCHA kind of figured out a different home, and now they are a much better team.
Colorado's in the Big Ten. What's going on there?
It's the Colorado ended up joining us, joining up with UND and the other schools that matter in this division.
So the Gophers play the Bulldogs, right? That's great. That's fantastic.
It's the Bulldogs came with us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
great.
So the Gophers just decided to head over there, and I could do an entire podcast on.
So anyway,
on my dislike of the Gophers, but yes, Zach Parisi, former UND great for the season he was here, before he went, I'm too good for college hockey. I really should be playing in the pros. Now.
UND recruits the best. That's
UND probably would have won the national championship again last year, but and they are currently ranked number 1 in the pre-rankings. But yes, Zach Parisi is in fact taking up a considerable amount of cap space for the Minnesota Wild. He hasn't really been doing much over the last couple of years, but by God, that contract he has is truly spectacular.
Couldn't happen to a better dude. Anyway, so apparently at one point he also suffered from a herniated disc, and Chad Graff talked to the doctor for the Wild that managed it, and apparently there were times when Parisi could only be upright for like 20 minutes an entire day. The only way to relieve the pain was to lie down.
I wouldn't know what that's like at all from my herniated disc earlier this winter. Yeah.
Yeah. So, which you podcasted through one end of that, right?
There was at least one episode that I was recording lying down. Yes. It's why I bought the boom arm for my mic. So I could record lying down and
Commitment to the craft. Give it to the Patreon, guys.
Patreon.com/Norse Code. Bonus episodes and being able to make it so that James can podcast through extreme pain. I forget
and extreme painkillers.
I might have been under a lot of painkillers for that episode. I don't really remember it, but
you were, and you unfortunately did not say anything wildly out of pocket. Yeah, it's too bad.
I should be trying harder. Okay, my bad. Anyway, continue.
So the problem, of course, is that a herniated disc can like dislodge easily and become significantly worse at like a moment's notice, right? You can take an enormous hit and nothing happens, and you can take a small hit on the next play, and it can be a huge problem. And so that's why both doctors, I would guess, would recommend that he not play, despite the fact that, this might be an amount of pain that somebody could conceivably play through. The amount of, pain that football players play through, we went through this like 2-3 episodes ago, is extraordinary. And so that is more the issue, is that the capacity for it to get a lot worse is really enormous, regardless of the amount of pain that Hunter's feeling right now. And so, and it can press on a nerve, which is probably what happened to you, and is what happened to Parisi. And so surgery to end it was probably the best long-term solution for Hunter, which, it's always difficult for athletes, right? Because if Hunter was planning on holding out, it would have been really nice for him to be able to get into a couple of games this year and prove that he can maintain a really high level of play. But if he is a quote unquote injury risk, right, and surgery magnifies that possibility, it's going to be more difficult for him to secure a more reasonable contract, because the contract he's on right now is just not reasonable for a player of his talent level. And so, yeah, it does complicate things, but it does kind of make the picture clearer for the Vikings. Like in some ways, not like in the Sidney Rice should have gotten surgery early in the offseason instead of late in the offseason, but in some ways it might have been better if Hunter had made this decision earlier, just so the Vikings could kind of know. And this isn't to blame Hunter. This is just by happenstance. It so happens that, it would have been easier for the Vikings had they known that the Hunter was just going to be out for the season and he'd taken the surgery earlier. Plus, you get a couple of weeks ahead in your recovery time, which, who knows, right? That could be pretty meaningful when it comes down to the next offseason. So now the Vikings just don't have a defensive line. They already didn't have Hunter, but now we know for sure they're just not going to have a defensive line this year. And that's not to rag on Ifeadi Odenigbo, who I think is pretty good. He did all right these past 2-3 weeks, I should say. And so, he's playing better, right? Now that he's had to play a lot more. The difference between being a starter and being, a rotational backup is pretty huge. Obviously, Everson Griffin navigated that well. Danielle Hunter navigated that well. But it is usually pretty difficult to do a pretty good job when you kind of switch roles, because you're no longer on third down. You have to do a lot more reading and reacting. You have to do a lot more diagnosing of the defense. You have to do a lot more setup and payoff. There's a lot of differences, right, between being a third down specialist where a tackle doesn't see you all game and being an every down specialist where you've got to worry about the threat of the run. You've got to worry about contain. You've got to worry about, tackle getting kind of used to your moves. You've got to worry about all this other stuff, plus conditioning. And so that was not going super great for Odenigbo to begin. And then it did. And then it went pretty well. And so I'm kind of excited to see him, but mostly there's just not a defensive line. You're going to see probably somebody like Eddie Yarbrough step up. You're probably going to see, some experimentation that's happening along the interior. We'll see some more Jalen Holmes, obviously, who has moved past Yarbrough on the depth chart. But you don't have a lot of confidence in this group to be able to generate pressure. And then, the interior is still the same awful interior, right? Like Jaleel Johnson might have a play or two that's kind of nice, but for the most part, he and Shamar Stephan aren't doing very much, not even against the run. The fact that they reactivated Hercules Mata'afa, that's pretty telling, right? So there's just not a lot there. And so quarterbacks are going to have a little bit more time in the pocket. That's going to expose a pretty young secondary. And maybe this is good developmentally, right? Because trial by fire, but mostly it's just going to suck. And honestly, I think that secondary, a couple of weeks from now, we're going to have to remember, hey, the secondary is playing abysmally, but a lot of this probably isn't entirely their fault. The ball should be out in like 2.5 to 3 seconds, and they're being forced to defend for 4 or 5. So that's something we're going to have to consider when we evaluate the secondary going forward, because it's going to look really bad. But that's something to keep in mind. And yeah, like at least Ngakoue got the coverage sacks, right? Like no one else seemed to be able to do it. So you've got that, but man, that defensive line looks bleak. And when you consider like a year ago, I mean, I wouldn't say it was the strength of the team, but it was a strength that it had over other teams.
Certainly wasn't a negative.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't a negative, but now it's like it might be the worst defensive line in the NFL right now. I'm trying to think of a worse one that's not like completely injured. And obviously Hunter is injured, so it's not like a fair 1-to-1 comparison, but
well, how about I toss out a couple of team names here, and we kind of we try to figure this out. Well, let's look at the worst defenses in the league, and see which one is actually the worst.
Yeah.
All right, first one I have to think about is the Jets.
Okay, that's pretty bad. They do have Quinn and Williams, but they don't really have any edge presence. They don't have another interior defender. They had one play well today, but for the most part, it's pretty bad. I would take the Vikings over the Jets defensive line. Actually, now they have a better player who is substantially better, who's playing pretty well for the past couple of weeks. And so if you want to use that tiebreaker, I think you could argue that the Jets defensive line is better. But I guess I would take the Vikings defensive line over that, because the rest of that group is just garbage.
Cowboys.
Oh boy. Well, if you want Everson Griffin back, he's on the market. So is Dontari Poe. But no, DeMarcus Lawrence played really well this last week. They still have Eldon Smith. That interior with I think it's like Malik Collins is not very good. I expected Collins to play a lot better this year. But the fact that they've got some production, and especially because they've got DeMarcus Lawrence, I would say that the Cowboys defensive line is better. And that's a rough group. That's not very good. So I would say it's better.
What about the Jags?
I was about to say Brian Burns. He's a Panther. So it kind of depends.
There's a lot of players on the Jags from last year where you can go, oh wait, no, they're on another team.
Yeah. Kayvon Chason is not doing as well as I expected, but Josh Allen is doing all right. I would say that their defensive line is decent. Like Taven Bryan isn't very good, but he got a little bit better. But yeah, I would say that their edge presence is a little bit better.
What about the Browns? Let's just go ahead and just dig in on those people who missed Stefanski, who I know is the offensive head of this beast, but let's just go over to the Browns real quick.
Do way better. So even if you got rid of Myles Garrett, if you're like, hey, Myles Garrett, you've got a herniated disc, you're out. You still have, I think Kerry Hyder is still on that team. You obviously still have Sheldon Richardson, who's pretty up and down still, kind of like he was with the Vikings, but he's just come off some pretty good games. Larry Ogunjobi is not having his best year, but he is a surprisingly good nose tackle for somebody his size. They've got another edge rusher that came on for a couple of weeks whose name doesn't sound like an edge rusher. I totally forgot his name, but he actually was able to produce mostly with the help of Myles Garrett, but still wasn't bad. Porter Gustin, that's it. It was just like, that guy, that's a name? He's all right. Olivier Vernon, his name is kind of more recognizable than his game. He's not that great anymore. But Adrian Claiborne is there. I would certainly take, even if you got rid of Myles Garrett, I would certainly take the Browns defensive line over the Vikings.
Let's go with finally two teams that you know incredibly well. Let's go with the Eagles and the Bills.
The Bills defensive line I absolutely would take, and it's so much easier to say that now that they had this game last Sunday when they had like 19 sacks. But Jerry Hughes, he was getting a ton of pressure. He just wasn't getting home. He ended up getting involved in 2 or 3 sacks. I think he ends up with like 2.0 sacks, but 2 of them are half sacks or something like that. But he also helped create a bunch of sacks. Trent Murphy had a really good game today. Ed Oliver had a really good game, but he's had when he's not on the injury report. So he was on the injury report 3 weeks this year, and all of those games were just awful for him. But when he's not on the injury report, he was actually really good. So the first 2 weeks of the season, he was really good. He had a really phenomenal game this week. I mean, that is a really good defensive line that I think a lot of people don't think is good. because it hasn't gotten a ton of sacks. And so that's a team that I think is doing all right. And then the Eagles, Fletcher Cox is still playing pretty well. Javon Hargrave is not playing as well as I would have expected, and neither is Malik Jackson. But they've still got a fair amount of talent. Fletcher Cox is still playing pretty well. Brandon Graham is finally getting sacks, so he's always this like pressure maven. He always gets a ton of pressures, but he never gets a ton of sacks. This year he's getting sacks. Derek Barnett's all right. But both of these defensive lines handily beat the Vikings for sure.
Darn shame. So there has been some talk this week about whether or not players like Harrison Smith are available for trade. What do you think would be a fair trade value for someone like Harrison Smith? And who else would potentially be, there's been, talks about Thielen, but I still find it hard to believe that the Vikings would get rid of Thielen on top of all of the offensive stuff. So, who do you think, or what do you think would be fair trade value for Harrison Smith, and who else do you believe would likely be next on the trading block?
Yeah, so I would expect Harrison Smith to go for like a late second, early third, and I know that sounds pretty low to Vikings fans. But the issue is twofold. The first is that most people don't think of safeties as very high value, including apparently Zimmer himself, even though I think that they're very valuable. And I think the second one is you just don't know when Harrison Smith's going to hit his cliff. It feels like he's already slowed down over the past 2 years. So he's played pretty well for the Vikings. So it's not as if, he's slowed down. It's not like he fell off a cliff, but it feels like, and this is a very kind of subjective, difficult to test statement. So, take it with a grain of salt, but it feels like, there's kind of more there that's missing that you didn't get, 2016, 2017, 2015, when he was, playing at this insane level. But he's very good. So you're still going. And then the second issue is that, the first issue is his positional value. The second issue is it feels like he's dropped off. The third issue, I guess, is also related to the age thing, but it's just like, even if he doesn't drop off, how much more are you going to be able to extract in terms of value? Like, it's just like, okay, so he's still pretty good. Can he kind of adapt to a system that, outside of the Vikings where he doesn't have that framework with him? So if I'm looking for teams that might use him, interestingly, ironically, the Cleveland Browns could replace Andrew Sendejo with him. That would be pretty good. They're 5-2. They're pushing for, the division, right? It's going to be hard, but they've got a pretty bad secondary, except Denzel Ward is really good. And so they probably need a little bit more support. So that would make a ton of sense. The Cowboys are still competing for the division, which is hilarious at 2-5, so they could make a trade. I could see the Saints doing it. It sounds like both Marcus Williams and Von Bell are just kind of on the outs there. That's something that both of those players might need new environments, especially Marcus Williams. It'd be kind of funny if he went to Minneapolis, but that's an area where they can make a replacement and really support Marshawn Lattimore. Those teams make a lot of sense. I guess the Cardinals could pair someone with Budda Baker, who's on like a defensive player of the year tear. That would make a fair amount of sense to have like two insanely versatile safeties. Who's the other guy? Chris Banjo or something like that? Like, that doesn't even sound like a real person. Deontay Thompson. I think you could replace them. But those are the potential, moves to win the division for those for those teams that they could make. They've got a spot. They've got a way to make that position effective. But safeties aren't worth that much, and Harrison Smith's kind of old, so you might only get a bottom of the second sort of deal for him, maybe a third and change. So that's the problem there. Beyond that, you could trade Adam Thielen, who I think would be worth a little bit more, like a mid-second, maybe even an early second. It kind of depends on how teams evaluate his injury likelihood. Just kind of given his history is not like long, but back issues are always a worry. Plus a hamstring issue in addition to that. The hamstring issue is what kept him out last year, but he had back issues the year before that didn't necessarily keep him out of games, but limited his production. So Thielen's a possibility. Riley Reef, I think, is the most likely possibility. I mean, it already seemed like he was going to leave the team. They asked him essentially to rework his contract to make room for Yannick Ngakoue. And as Collar's article kind of points out, that could have blown up the locker room potentially. And so they made this risky move, asked somebody who was earning his pay. He's having a great year, earning his pay, except I think the last game he had against the Falcons, but otherwise, great year, earning his pay. And now they're just asking him to take a pay cut, right? So that might be an easy trade just to kind of get that guy out of there. Not because he's a locker room problem, but because you just don't want somebody who's resentful of your organization necessarily, there, right? So that's another player that you could potentially move. Kyle Rudolph obviously is a player that you could potentially move. He's still pretty talented, mostly in red zone situations, but somebody that you can still use if you're a team that needs a little bit more red zone production. There's a couple of teams there. Or you just need like somebody to complement your tight end group, kind of like the Vikings are doing right now with Irv Smith. Again, the Saints, could complement Jared Cook with him. But yeah, it's some, and any of these offensive players could obviously go to Cleveland, especially with Odell Beckham out, right? Adam Thielen would fit in really well there. I don't think Cleveland is getting exactly what they want out of David Njoku. So you could kind of pair the two together. Like Harrison Bryant just went off today for Cleveland, which is just kind of weird. You could have, Kyle Rudolph kind of mentor those two for a little bit. Those players are on the block. If you wanted to be really extreme, I think this is unlikely, but if you're kind of going for the gold in terms of trades, Eric Hendricks could probably go for a second. Oh, and I didn't even define Kyle Rudolph's trade value. I think it's probably a fourth or a fifth. But Eric Hendricks could probably potentially go for a second. He's not having a bad year by any means, so he's still playing pretty well. But then you're getting into kind of these players that are not really 30, right? They're still like 27, 28, but hitting kind of the peak of their capabilities, and so their trade value should, in theory, be pretty high. But there's a couple of teams that could use linebacker help too. So, all of those players could potentially, and let's say the Vikings trade all of these players, right? They figure out a way to get the cap sorted out in terms of dead hit. They trade Adam Thielen, they trade Harrison Smith, they trade Kyle Rudolph, they trade Riley Reef, they trade Eric Hendricks. Now you're stocked, right? Let's say we get kind of the worst versions of all of these trades, right? So you've got Adam Thielen for a third, that would kind of suck. Harrison Smith for a late third, that would kind of suck. Kyle Rudolph for a fifth. Riley Reef for a third, right? Eric Hendricks for, let's say a third is the worst scenario, right? So now you've got like 4 thirds and a fifth. Maybe one of those is a fourth. Now you've got enough ammo to kind of move around in the draft a little bit, right? Obviously, you don't have a second anymore because you traded you traded it away for Yannick, but you got a third back. So now you've got like 5 third-round picks and a first-round pick. You could either trade down in the first round, which I don't think a lot of Vikings fans want, or you can trade up. And I think that would mean, Kirk Cousins, right? So you trade Kirk Cousins, maybe a second-round pick. His contract is like brutal, right? But I would think that because you're trading him, and we'll get into the cap stuff later when we've got a question about it, but because you're trading him, and Chad, which I haven't read his article yet, but Chad also has a trade value piece, which I'll link in the show notes, but I'm sure it's worth reading. Again, I haven't read it yet because it was just published, and then Monday Night Football happened, and then we recorded this. But I'm sure that there's he's identifying hey, they wouldn't trade him to the Bears, but what a perfect team that could use Kirk Cousins right now. I actually can't think of a more perfect team for Cousins right now, for a team that is in playoff position, needs an extra push, and has every piece but quarterback, right? They've got Allen Robinson, Darnell Mooney's looking really good. I still personally believe in Anthony Miller. Jimmy Graham is producing in the red zone. If they can just get that offense going, they're really dangerous, but they wouldn't trade in division, right? So let's say you trade him to San Francisco, Jimmy G doesn't have it anymore. If Baker hadn't played lights out this week, you trade him to Cleveland, right?
Was just about to bring that up. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And there, you don't have to worry about learning the system at all. But yeah, let's say you trade him, you get a second round pick. Let's assume the team wants him and it's not just a cap move like Brock Osweiler. So you get a second round pick, get that back. You got like 5 third-round picks, fourth round, an extra fourth and an extra fifth. I think you can use that to trade up, right? If we take a look at Tankathon and see which teams are at the top of the draft, not every one of them needs a quarterback. And obviously, if you trade away your quarterback, you've got that capability, right? So Miami in 5th place does not need a quarterback, and they're in 5th place because they have Houston's pick. Maybe the Giants don't draft a quarterback. I could see them not doing that. That would be really funny. But you could trade up. You'd still probably be able to keep one of those thirds in your 4th and your 5th, right? So you have to trade like your other, like 4 other third-round picks, which I'm sure the Giants would be very happy to have, and your 2nd-round pick. But now you trade up and you get Justin Fields or Zach Wilson, whoever the second best quarterback in the draft is, and you still have a 3rd-round pick, a 4th-round pick, a 5th-round pick. Obviously, now you need a receiver. You probably don't need a tight end. Like, you can get one later. But now you need a receiver. Now you need a safety. Now you need a tackle. In theory, you move Ezra Cleveland to tackle, and now you just need a guard, which is cheaper, right? And you probably need a linebacker, right? Because we traded Eric Kendricks. But I think that you fill one of the spots in free agency with a young guy, and you grab your receiver with the 3rd-round pick. It's supposed to be a really good receiver class this year. You grab a couple of linebackers in the 4th round, make Troy Dye, who's healthy again, who just got activated, compete with all these other 4th-round picks at linebacker, and maybe you're in a good spot. Oh, and I would have mentioned Anthony Barr, but I don't think you can trade players on IR. You got Eric Wilson, coming back. So you've got like a decent, not great, but a decent linebacker unit, and now you have to kind of figure out safety, which the Vikings have historically not invested in. You make a couple of free agent signings now that you've freed up all this cap space for 2021, and I think you've set the stage for maybe not competing in 2021, but competing in 2022 because you didn't have to give up future picks to trade up. So that is like a dream scenario, and I might have gotten these values way wrong. I try to be kind of pessimistic to make it work out, but that is kind of what a complete teardown looks like if you're willing to kind of remove all your locker room leaders in the process.
When was
and I would trade Dalvin Cook, by the way, but that's way too unreasonable for the scenario.
Well, like the Vikings just paid him too, so it's like this is that's what ends up making it a bit more difficult.
Which that did happen to Odell Beckham.
Well, yes. When was the last time that the Vikings had what you would call a traditional like rebuild? Like within the last couple of years, was this like the year
2011?
I was gonna say the year before Teddy, or is this the year that we get Christian Ponder?
Yeah, I don't think, because did 2014 feel like a rebuild? Because I think they just, obviously they got a new coach in the door, right? But
yeah,
they didn't they drafted a linebacker at 9th and they drafted a quarterback at 32. Like, it didn't feel like they did like trade Jared Allen, right? Like, it's not as if it
felt like a fresh start, but it didn't feel like they had taken all of the things that made the Vikings and sent them out.
They kept Adrian Peterson, they kept Chad Greenway, they kept Kyle Rudolph. Like, they kept a bunch of players that, maybe you could have justified moving on from. But yeah, I think they didn't keep Antoine Winfield because they actually was the previous regime that got rid of him. But they kept all those corners, right? Which Xavier Rhodes, that turned out, they ended up getting rid of Chris Cook. But like they kept a lot of the same players. Like, yeah, they built around their young studs like Harrison Smith and Xavier Rhodes, and they ended up keeping like a lot of that offensive line around for a while. Obviously, Matt Khalil, and the center John Sullivan. Sorry, I was blanking for a second. Phil Loadholt. Like, they didn't get rid of their vets, and they signed Matt Castle so they wouldn't have to play Teddy right away. So like, that wasn't like a rebuild. It was a refresh for sure. I think that's a good way to put it. But yeah, even though they drafted a quarterback, I think 2011 was that, right? Which is when they actually did trade Jared Allen. Now that I'm thinking about the timeline.
Yeah, I was going to correct you. I was waiting for that. Yeah. Boy, yeah, because that would have been right after Favre. Right after Favre cracked his head on the frozen TCF Tundra. And well, everyone knew that after 2010 that the Vikings would be remarkably different. But I was just trying to remember the pieces that had left in after the 2010 season into the 2011 season, because that was an interesting change of sorts. So yeah, that's
So let's see. They traded. So they got Christian Ponder. They got Kyle Rudolph. They got Christian Ballard too.
if they got Christian Ponder, this was also the year that they got Donovan McNabb for a game.
Right. They traded the third round pick because they didn't know they were rebuilding. They traded that third round pick, but they did get some compensatory picks for Artis Hicks and Chester Taylor. They don't like so
Chester
Wikipedia
Taylor. There's we did the 2009 rewatch episode of the Saints game that was easily the most talked about episode of Norse Code ever. And there was a lot of fun doing the whole, oh, hey, there's a guy's name, there's a guy's name, there's a guy's name. And Chester Taylor, Chester Taylor leaving to the Bears, I believe.
Yeah, it was the Bears, yeah.
Yeah, he was going off to be his own man, and that didn't end up working out.
Did he get to play with Adrian Peterson of Bears fame too? Did they overlap?
For the Vikings? Yeah, of course.
No. I mean the Bears, Adrian Peterson.
Oh, boy, I would have to look at that. I'm not I'm not as confident.
Okay, yeah, but so the receivers that year, because they didn't sign Michael Jenkins until next year.
Correct.
Right? No, they must have signed him that year because they threw deep to him. So he must yeah, they did.
When did they have okay, my bad. Yep.
They signed Emmanuel Arsenault. I think Greg Camarillo, he was already on the team because he knew Favre.
God, this is going to be brutal.
Percy Harvin was already on the team, and then Devin Aromashadu finished the season healthy. Other than that, it was that's a terrible. So it's Michael Jenkins, Emmanuel Arsenault, Devin Aromashadu, Greg Camarillo, and Percy Harvin, but like 2011, not 2012 Percy Harvin. Holy crap. They must have also had Stephen Burton that year too. Ugh.
Yeah, there's some not fun.
A rebuild year.
Yeah, that you could call it. You could definitely call it that. I'm struggling to remember a year where the Vikings ended up doing the full fire sale thing. So that was kind of my point, is that if you're looking at this from the way that the Jags are doing things, where they are just selling off anyone who could remotely be over 25. Even if it's basically Logan's Run over there. So if it's you don't see the Vikings do that historically. So it was, if you're looking at a traditional fire sale rebuild sort of thing, that doesn't seem to be what happens in Minnesota historically, but it's not to say there haven't been full on rebuild years. Yeah. Boy.
I'm looking through the 2012 roster right now, and I saw that Lamarck Brown was on the practice squad, and I remember him catching up to me after a training camp practice and saying, "Hey, man, you called me slow." That was it.
Well, was he?
Yeah, man, you ran like a 4.8, dude.
I mean,
it's like he's faster than me, but I don't care about that.
Yeah, you're not getting paid on how fast you're able to do the 40. That's not you're plus you're a corner anyway. It's not you're not playing offense. It doesn't matter.
Right. I don't have to cover him.
No, absolutely. It might be easier, honestly, as it turns out.
Maybe I could have covered him, dude. He was not good.
No, as it turns out, it might have been easier as a result of his slowness. Let's just go into the mailbag here, because we've got a couple questions along these same lines. Big Tony asks, if the Wilfs told you that you must keep on one of Spielman, Zimmer, and Cousins, who would you choose out of the three?
So I think my instinctive response would be should be Cousins, right? Because quarterbacks are harder to find than coaches or front office staff. Plus, in addition to that, quarterbacks can elevate a bad coaching group or a bad front office, right? I mean, just take a look at how long B.O.B. was able to survive because of Deshaun Watson. Obviously that ended up ending, but like they won. I mean, they were like playoff contenders, right? They won in previous years, despite that kind of roster management. So instinctively, you want to say the quarterback, but I think you want to orient yourself around the goal, not the highest average win. So I think there's a decent chance that Cousins might be the one of the three that increases your average wins the most, but that's not your goal. Your goal is the championship. And I think it's very difficult to make the argument at this point that Cousins can bring you to a championship. And obviously it's difficult to make the argument that any of the three of them can. But last week I just made the argument that you want to hold on to Mike Zimmer because he's a lot more adaptive and open-minded than a lot of people think. And that it seems, the only thing that's not the case, that where it doesn't seem to be the case, is running the ball a lot. Like that's the thing that he likes. And that is pretty significant, but in almost everything else, he's very adaptive and innovative, right? And he's willing to put up with a bunch of different types of offenses, so long as you run the ball a little bit. I would think actually it's Zimmer, and the comparison to Andy Reid I think makes a ton of sense. So obviously, Andy Reid has a direct role in that offense, and that innovation that he provides is very flashy, and it does a ton to help them win games. But Zimmer is almost as innovative on defense. Like the fact that he spearheaded the double A gap. I wouldn't say revolution, but it wasn't common when Zimmer did it in Cincinnati or Minnesota. And then it became very common. And there were a couple of other teams that did it. I don't want to say he invented it, but a lot of people consider him the godfather of the double A gap stuff, right? Then a bunch of other teams parroted it. He moved on, and then it got solved, and then other teams moved away from it. And then he started doing all the cover 4 stuff when everyone else was still stuck in cover 3, and now a bunch of teams are moving to cover 4. Like, he's innovating all of this defensive stuff that other people are catching up to what he's doing, right? And so I think that, his win percent, when Andy Reid was fired, his win percentage was 583. At the beginning of the season, Zimmer's win percentage was like 584. So it was really close. Now, obviously, it's lower than Andy Reid's was at this point than when Reid was fired. But Zimmer is fundamentally a really good coach. Now, he obviously doesn't have the excuse this year that he's had other years, right? We talked about it on either the last show or 2 shows ago, where it's just like, well, now he actually does have the quarterback that he wants, and things are falling apart. And this is the first time things have both fallen apart, and the quarterback that was on the team last year is the one he wants and is on the team this year. So it isn't great, right? Like, obviously things are falling apart, and Zimmer plays a pretty significant role in that. But I don't know many teams that would bring Case Keenum to the NFC Championship game, right? Like, I just don't think that that's a reasonable ask for most coaches. I don't know many teams that can survive the quarterback trend that the Vikings have and still consistently, not every year, obviously, but like every other year, make the playoffs. I don't know any team that can survive the defensive injuries that they had right before the Saints game and come out with one of the best defensive performances in the playoffs that year. If not the best, if you exclude the 49ers, both against the Vikings and the Packers. Yeah, I mean, he does really great, innovative stuff. He's still ahead of the curve on a ton of these things, and he's still produced in situations where other coaches haven't. If you look at the end of last year, if you look at the coaches who were ahead of him on the win list, the only coaches that were ahead of him had some kind of stability at quarterback, right? And we talked about this a lot. Now, obviously, now he has stability at quarterback, and it's not working, right? So again, he's clearly not a perfect coach. But Bill Belichick is suffering right now too. Not that Zimmer's built up the cachet that Belichick has, but like the point is that good coaches can have down years, which is what happened when Reid was fired. So I would probably keep Zimmer. A good coach is a little bit easier to find, I think, than a good quarterback, and a good coach can be stymied by a quarterback more than a quarterback can be stymied by a bad coach. But I think that Zimmer maximizes your Super Bowl probability, whereas Cousins, I think, because of his problems with situational football, makes it difficult to win a Super Bowl. Now, obviously, I think you can win a Super Bowl with him. I think Jimmy Garoppolo is a worse quarterback, and the 49ers were on the cusp of that, right? Peyton Manning, obviously, was a worse quarterback in 2015, specifically, than Cousins was, and won a Super Bowl. Eli Manning plays a style of quarterback where you can play worse and produce better outcomes. You can just go on a run, right? But he's 1-2, right? So like it's obviously possible. And then you can just go all the way back into all those great defenses with whatever quarterbacks like your Trent Dilfers and stuff like that. But even recently, we've seen good quarterbacks be on the cusp. So good, not great quarterbacks or even bad quarterbacks be on the cusp. And I think it's possible, right? But I think you're maximizing your wins with somebody like Zimmer. So I would probably keep Zimmer out of those three. I think Spielman's really good. And then the next question, of course, is who do you replace him with? If it's a random, and I think the fairest version of this question is random, but the reason this comes up with Spielman is because if you can replace him with George Payton, who everybody seems to want to hire, that's not only logical, but internal, and you don't have to worry about continuity, and he's still supposed to be a pretty good talent evaluator, you're probably in a good spot. But I would say to make this exercise fair, it would be random. The thing is, like, I think Spielman is a good GM, but I think that it is difficult to be an extraordinarily bad one. Again, Bill O'Brien did it. I actually think Steve Keim is not a very good GM, and he's just being kind of protected by Kyler Murray. But, most GMs are all right, and you don't have to worry too much about it. Draft picks are kind of random. If you can't get the trade value that Spielman seems to get during the draft, fine, whatever. So yeah, I would, that seems to be the most replaceable of those three. So that's probably where it's the easiest for me to move on. So I guess I would keep Zimmer. I think this is a really fascinating question. I think that you could make an argument in any of those three ways. Yeah, no, I'm kind of excited to, people should, email their answers or stuff. I'm really curious about this.
Brad Davis asks, if Spielman is primarily responsible for bringing in talent, and one of the major problems with the Vikings this year is the lack of talent, then why would Zimmer be on the hot seat? It doesn't seem like Spielman has actually done a good job of drafting the last 4 or 5 years, particularly with the high draft picks, and it seems he has signed some really bad contracts in terms of loading the Vikings down with salary cap problems.
So this is kind of where it gets. So that's actually another good question. Again, remember, I would keep Zimmer, right? I think one of those things is Spielman makes moves based off of the feedback that Zimmer gives him, right? So if Spielman says, hey, I could either, spend up on a corner or spend up on a nose tackle, which one do you want? And Zimmer says nose tackle, draft me a corner and I can develop him. And Spielman trusts that. And it turns out Zimmer cannot develop this corner quickly enough to be in contention for the NFC North. That's not really on Spielman. Now, obviously, he has to make his own talent determinations as well, so that's not fair. But the Vikings lost a lot of players, but aside from, weirdly, Xavier Rhodes, who's played extraordinarily well? Like Linval Joseph just had a good game for the Chargers. It wasn't bad, but he just really hasn't played out of his mind or anything like that. Everson Griffin is being shopped for a trade. Trey Waynes is hurt. We can't really tell. Mackenzie Alexander is doing just kind of all right. He's not playing as well as he did last year. Okay, great. Where's Josh Klein? Now, I'd love for Josh Klein to be on the Vikings and play better than Pat Elflein and do what he needs to do because he's better. But it's not like another team signed him, right? So how we have to accept that there's some chance that we're wrong. If 31 other teams looked at his tape and saw their own guards get injured and decided, I'd rather have like Alex Bars or whoever was the left guard for the Bears this week. Whoever that guy is. I'd rather have that guy who normally plays right guard play left guard for us in a pinch instead of, signing Josh Klein. Like a bunch of teams, every team made this decision, and a bunch of these teams have seen injuries along the offensive line. So there might be something there. So we see a lot of talent leave. Only one of those players, and the one I think we least likely would have expected to succeed, is succeeding, right? Like if you listed all these players that left, you'd say, so Trey Waynes, Xavier Rhodes, Linval Joseph, Everson Griffin, who's going to perform the best? Mackenzie Alexander. And you'd probably say, Everson had a pretty good year last year. Yeah, he fell off, but, he only has to be in a rotation in Dallas. Maybe he's number one. Linval, he's not as good as he was, but, he's a nose tackle. Those tend to age pretty well, relatively speaking. And he can hold the gap. Maybe he can't create pressure, but he can hold the gap, and that's all they're going to ask him to do. So maybe I'll put him number 2. Mackenzie Alexander, slot corner, pretty good year last year. Maybe he's number 3. Trey Waynes, he's average. That's great. That's number 4. Xavier Rhodes, 5. I think everybody would put Xavier Rhodes last. and he's playing the best, right? So I don't know that you can fault Spielman for that. So these are part of the conversations that Spielman has with Zimmer. I think really the problem is just these things occur in cycles, and it's impossible to keep a window open forever unless you have a Tom Brady or you are Bill Belichick, right? And so sometimes your talent cycle is just going to sync up, and they're going to all leave at once, right? So yeah, I think it's on Spielman for signing an onerous contract with Anthony Barr. I think it's on Spielman for overvaluing the running back position, which again, some of that Zimmer. I think it's on Spielman for not having, a great offensive line, right? And I don't think it's about, the investment. I think it's about, who they decided to invest in. Okay, great. But it's not like the team is performing up to their talent level. I think that's pretty fair to say, right? Like Zimmer and Kubiak have to figure out why Kirk Cousins is throwing like 10 interceptions this year, like why he's throwing so many picks. They have to figure out why, despite the fact that both receivers are actually pretty good, there's not a ton of receiving production at the moments when the game matters, right? Like first drive, great. Garbage time, great. Why isn't Adam Thielen getting the ball in the second and third quarter? Like, what's happening? The game's already lost by the fourth quarter, and now he hit 100 yards. I mean, he's had like 2 100-yard games this year. They're like the quietest 100-yard games I've seen from a receiver.
And you wouldn't think that he has the most touchdowns of any receiver in the NFL either.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. He's leading. He's got like, what, 7? He's leading the league in touchdowns. Who cares? Like, they don't matter.
He is the king of garbage time this year.
Right. Last week, Justin Jefferson, I think, led all receivers in yardage with 166. Okay. I left him off the players of the week list, and I got one question about it. Like, it didn't matter. He had 89 yards at the end of the third quarter, and then like 70 odd yards, right? It must have been 77 in the fourth quarter. And that's when he exploded. Like, great, dude, you beat Kendall Sheffield when the safeties were playing like 30 yards off. Again, Justin Jefferson's good, right? I don't want to, but like, why isn't this production happening when it has the ability to impact the likelihood of a win or a loss? Zimmer has to ask this question, right? What can be done about a defense that has a Pro Bowl talent in Yannick Ngakoue, that has, I guess one because of Anthony Barr being injured, but for a while, 2 of the best linebackers in the NFL in terms of having a good linebacker room. You've got the 2 best safeties. Why is the defense like dead last in some of these metrics? So a lot of that, the team isn't very talented at a lot of positions, but it's also playing well below its talent level. And that sounds like a coaching problem. So yeah, I would say there's a bunch of reasons that Zimmer would be on the hot seat. That said, yeah, I'd rather keep Zimmer than Spielman. So it's not as if this question isn't without merit.
Next question is going to be from Eddie. Let's go to Eddie Crane. We haven't talked to the dog much this season. So Eddie asks, would you trade Dan Bailey to the Titans for a 5th-round pick and start McLaughlin for the rest of the season? Also, do we have any concrete indication that COVID infections affect performance after being cleared to play again? Basically, the Cam Newton question.
Yeah. So any athlete that's playing poorly will deny it, and Cam Newton, I think on the radio today, denied that COVID is impacting his performance. That doesn't tell us anything, because from the way that football players talk, right? They speak from a perspective of control what you can control, right? And so whether or not it's true, right? Like quarterbacks take on losses. Quarterbacks will blame themselves for losses. Whether or not it's true, it is productive for them to tell themselves that they could have done something to win the game. Same thing with a disease. And it's like not a great attitude just for your mental health or anything like that. But from the perspective of finding ways to improve, it is useful to isolate what elements you can control and deny that there are elements outside of your control as much as possible. So I don't really care that Cam Newton said, this has nothing, I just have to play better. This has nothing to do with COVID-19. It is telling that he went toe-to-toe with Russell Wilson then got put on the COVID-19 reserve list, and then played like garbage, right? I don't think that is a large enough sample size for us to say very much. A bunch of players have come back from the COVID reserve list. Some of them are high-level players that continue to play at a high level. Jeffrey Simmons is a really good example of that. The biggest issue is that we don't really know necessarily how many of these players test positive and how many of these players are quarantined for close contact. It's someone was it the entire Raiders offensive line? We know that one of them tested positive. Was it Trent Brown? Is he on the Raiders? And then the rest of the group just went into isolation, and only some of them came back for the game or something like that. I mean, it was an abysmal Raiders offensive line performance, but I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that half of them weren't there. We'll see, when whoever it was that was confirmed to test positive comes back, but we're just not going to have the sample size to really say that much. I would say it's particularized to the athlete, right? So when Von Miller was diagnosed with COVID-19 back in April, I want to say mid-April, April 15th or 17th or something like that. It was bad because he had a pre-existing condition, asthma, and he hadn't been able to fully recover when he talked about it again in mid to late May, May 20th or something like that. So it was a little longer than a month. And he was not breathing very well, and it was compounding upon his asthma. So a lot of his other symptoms. So he had a lot of the classic symptoms, you can't smell or taste or stuff like that. But a lot of those symptoms had subsided. I think, in fact, he was testing negative, and so he didn't really quote unquote have it anymore. But he had a long-term condition that was preventing him from working out effectively. So it does seem that it might be particularized to the athlete. So we may never get an answer to this question, whether or not players coming back from COVID-19, the reserve list, if they in fact tested positive, will play at a reduced performance level, and whether or not that's a result of a lingering condition, time away from the facility, the inability to game plan or practice effectively, kind of your mental state from going through that, any of those things, right? Because if it's some of that other stuff, maybe it'll impact you if you don't test positive, but you have to quarantine. The other stuff, it would depend specifically on how your case presents and whether or not you've got long-term symptoms. So it's very difficult to say. But I would say it's pretty likely. Oh, and then we also got news that Raquel Armstead, running back for the Jaguars, has been hospitalized twice. I'll link that. Which apparently, I guess, so Adam Schefter reported it Sunday? I want to say Sunday morning?
It was this weekend. I believe it was Sunday morning.
Yeah, which right before the game's great. Apparently it was reported before that, and it just didn't hit football Twitter, which I would find very unlikely, but I'll take a look at that, and I'll link the Raquel Armstead story if I can find it. Certainly I'll link a Sunday story if I can't find anything earlier than that. But yeah, he's been hospitalized twice. I would imagine that even if he's quote unquote cleared and he's kind of clear of the infectious stage of the virus, that he would not be kind of fit to play right away. So it is different for each athlete, but we don't have any evidence because we wouldn't have, I should say concrete evidence, which is a good way to put it, which was what it was in the wording of the question from Eddie. I wouldn't say we have concrete evidence that this is the case, but if you're asymptomatic, well, first, if you're asymptomatic, there's still the potential for long-term conditions to kind of arise. There's been reports of people who are asymptomatic through their infectious period, and then long-term problems, crop up later that impact them. But largely, if you're asymptomatic and you come back, you're probably just going to be fine, right? But it kind of depends on the nature of your condition. So that I wish there was a better answer to this, but I would say that we couldn't possibly know, but it is convenient and well within an athlete's incentive to believe that it doesn't. So we're probably not going to get a straight answer from them.
Also, you would trade Dan Bailey to the Titans.
Oh yeah, that part. Yeah, no, totally. So, I mean, only if we're doing if we're committed to the rebuild, because obviously he's pretty good, but who knows how much longer he's going to be good. He's not that young.
Nope, this is clear kicker window sort of thing. Let's just the Vikings fans are
Get him a ring.
Yeah, exactly. We need to make sure that we get Dan Bailey a ring. That's we have to do right by Dan Bailey, who turned it all around.
Do it for the Gipper, man.
God. I wasn't going there, but that's
do it for Dan Bailey.
It's about time that this franchise really tries to reward somebody who did, in fact, turn it around from a disastrous start. So yeah, I'm all in on getting Dan Bailey a ring. John Belk asks, if a team trades for Kirk before this year's deadline, does all of the dead cap that we'd have to take on mean they'd get him on a legitimately good contract, or am I completely misunderstanding how dead money works with trades?
So, apparently, given the Yannick Ngakoue trade, part of the trade is that one team can take on a certain portion of that contract, I guess. Apparently. I didn't know that. So I'm sorry, I'm a terrible NFL reporter, but that seems to be the case. So these terms are negotiable. But based off of the trade calculator that I use, which is at over the cap, and my knowledge of the structure of the contract, it is essentially this. The Vikings take on all of the guaranteed salary, but the team that acquires him takes on the remaining signing bonus. Which isn't how it works in terms of like money, I guess, but from a cap perspective. So the other team probably pays him, but the Vikings take on the cap hit. But like, because the Vikings already paid him the salary bonus. And so that's just an accounting trick where the signing bonus impacts the Vikings. So the Vikings are still on the hook for $1.5 million of the previous year's signing bonus. That's probably never going to go away. Plus also the $30 million signing bonus from the extension, which is $10 million for each of the next 3 years. So I guess it's structured weirdly because Cousins' contract was fully guaranteed before the extension. So if they trade him, the other team takes on, I want to say a $31.5 million hit, and the Vikings take on a $30.5 million hit, or the other way around, which actually makes more sense in my head, right? Because the other team has the guaranteed salary and the Vikings already paid out the signing bonus. But the calculators seem to go the other way. I would say it's probably the second way, where the other team takes on the guaranteed salary and the Vikings take on the signing bonus. But the calculator was kind of weird about it. Plus, the numbers are close enough that maybe I confused it. But the point is, about half of it goes to the other team in terms of cap hit, if there's no modifications to the trade and the contract in the trade. And the Vikings take on about half of it, which would be very good news, right? Because if the Vikings cut him, which obviously wouldn't happen, but as an example, the Vikings cut him, it is a $62 million cap charge, which, because his cap hit right now is $21 million, you get rid of his $21 million, then you add the $62 million back on top of it, which is a net cap charge of $41 million. So the Vikings currently have $5.5 million in cap space. After they cut him, they would have negative 35.5 million in cap space. But if you trade him, I mean, you're only at negative 15. It's just a $20 million difference, but you're at negative, or I guess negative 16 total. Negative 16 million in cap space, which la-di-da. I don't know, if you do the post-June 1st trade, which was a whole deal.
Careful with these stats. Yeah, those who listened to the bonus episode last week were able to hear all about Arif's troubles getting the June 1st stuff together.
That was wild. If we trust this calculator's post-June 1st stuff, which we have recent historical evidence that we shouldn't, the Vikings can save maybe $9.5 million by spreading it out over 2 years. So that's a post-June 1st designated trade and or a post-June 1st trade. So yeah, you might actually save money that way.
I'm forced to ask you the same question that I asked last week. Are you sure? Did you do it correctly?
Absolutely not. But when I submit a June 1st trade into the calculator, so hold on, let me press submit. Come on, guys. Well, let me press submit. I just press. I can
off to a
trade.
promising start. Okay.
They let me submit the trade, but not the post June 1st trade. The Vikings cap number. This is really funny. The Vikings cap number is unchanged. Oh, it's because it's for 2020. This is the same problem we had in the other episode.
Fantastic. Okay. Glad I asked, are you sure? And we decided to do a deep dive on this.
This is great. Yeah, so I guess a trade by this calculator says that they would save 10 million. I don't believe the calculator anymore. So I would say the Vikings probably lose money this year. So they would probably have to do something as well. Maybe negotiate it so that they take on even more of that money, or trade also Kyle Rudolph away. That sounds like that would work, right? I mean, he's pretty much free money at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then that would clear up enough space for you to be under the cap. You're just missing a tight end and a quarterback, which, I mean, who cares about those positions?
Yeah, those have never won anybody a Super Bowl, no. Raul asks, in the spirit of Queen's Gambit, are there ELO ratings for coaches? Where does Zimmer rank? There seems to be some coaches he clearly hasn't bested in games. Example, Pete Carroll.
So for people unfamiliar, ELO is a rating that was invented by a mathematician whose last name was Elo for chess. And so I think he started at 1,000, and then it awards you points based, and you can start out anywhere. It's just a formula. You can change the base rate, but it awards you points based off of how much higher or lower rated the person you're playing is. So if 1,000 person beats someone with 1,000 ELO rating, the change is relatively average. It's decent, right? 20 points or something like that. If you beat someone with a 1,300 or 1,500 ELO, the change is massive. If you beat someone with like a 400 ELO, it might even be negative, but it is very, very small, your change in rating. So that's the idea behind ELO. It is a strength adjusted rating, right? I looked this up very briefly, so not very extensively, but I looked this up to see if there are ELO ratings for coaches as opposed to for teams. So 538 has an ELO rating for teams. And the nature of ELO ratings in chess, by the way, is that they always kind of creep up. But there's no ELO ratings for NFL coaches. I did find ELO ratings for like soccer coaches. I was going to say Premier League, but it extends to all of the major European leagues. So yeah, if you wanted to find that, Google NFL head coach ELO, and you'll end up with some soccer ELO ratings as you would want to in that scenario.
Clearly, we're going directly to what our listeners need. Speaking of which, let's go to this question from Kenneth Allen, who asks, how does Arif feel about the fact that the Vikings were on a bye and yet his favorite team still lost this week?
I mean, the Vikings did lose by trading away Yannick Ngakoue, but it's not really the way that one would talk about wins and losses.
Yeah, about that. That was a fun. I literally could have sat and watched another hour of the Seahawks Cardinals game on Sunday night. People would have dropped dead by the end of it, especially the Seahawks defense. But man, that was a lot of fun to sit and watch. Also, has Arif considered writing about why the Packers or writing about the Packers for once?
I don't know, maybe. I mean,
trying to jinx them.
Yeah, I understand the idea.
Just saying that to our listeners who aren't familiar with how you jinx everyone from the Bills to who was the next team after the Bills again?
It was the Bears.
Oh, that's right. You had said that your argument was the Bears weren't for real, right?
Well, apparently, whatever team I write about just gets worse.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, I'm all right. That's fair. Okay. So yeah, next week can we do the Packers? And now, you know what? Just avoid the Jets, because I feel like writing.
Yeah.
We're not going to reverse curse the Jets on this.
Uh, so I don't actually have a ton of control over which teams I'm writing about. I mean, I could just say yes or no, but I'm not the one who brought up the Bills or the Bears. It was the national editors. They were like, "Hey, Arif, at the beginning of the year, you said you might be able to do a column on whether or not this team is for real, because there's always surprise teams every year at the beginning of the season. So now it's we're about at that moment. The Bills seem like the most likely candidate for that article. Do you want to write it?" So I did. And they're like, okay, well, that was great, and it did particularly well because it was a Monday Night Football matchup. Well, another candidate is playing on Monday Night Football. Actually, two candidates: the Rams, the Bears. What would be more interesting to write about? And I thought, well, actually, the Bears would be more interesting to write about because the Rams, the argument is just that they've played the NFC East. That's not a crazy interesting argument. The Bears, there's all kinds of things, right? How sustainable is defense? Their red zone stuff. The fact that they switch quarterbacks halfway through the year. I think arguing about the Bears, I think, just draws more clicks, just because it's, I think, a more interesting topic. Not because Bears fans are like uniquely mad or anything. I'm sure Rams fans would not be happy to see a similar article. But I don't know. I think there's just some more meat on the bone for that. So I don't have a ton of control over that. Next week, if they ask me to write the same article, first, I don't know who it would be about at this point. But second, and I guess like is blank team secretly good and probably the Houston Texans, maybe, I don't know. But
No, they lost the title to Minnesota, who then lost the title to the Falcons, who then lost the title in spectacular fashion over to Detroit.
yeah, so the Lions secretly good. That would be fun to write, honestly.
You can make sure to give the Lions the Arif kiss of death. Trademark.
But yeah, I don't have a ton of control over this. Like I mean, I can decide whether or not I want to write it, but they served up the options to me and I had to choose between them. And it was like the Bears or the Rams. And I was like, I'd much rather write about the Bears being bad than the Rams being like, who knows? Because we didn't get a ton of resolution on the Rams, but like they just don't seem like as fun of a team to write about. So, maybe next week I'll write about the Rams. Who knows? But yeah, we'll see. But it's probably not the Packers. I would have written about them last year. That's the thing. But this year, they're playing well. It sucks.
Beef Brewski asks, have you noticed any differences in the play calling between Stefanski and Kubiak? I've watched a couple of Browns games, and it seems like they look more like the 2019 Vikings offense than the 2020 Vikings. Is this just a play calling difference or more of a matter of execution?
Well, so there's a couple of things that are significantly different. The first is that Stefanski's got a different offensive line coach who very often your offensive line coach is your run game coordinator, which is definitely the case in Cleveland. That run game is a wide zone run game that looks significantly more complex than what the Vikings do. So that itself is already a difference between the two offenses. But it's very clear that this year's Kubiak offense looks a lot different than last year's Stefanski offense, and not just because you don't have Stephon Diggs. They're much more willing to put more receivers on the field, especially early in the year. Now, obviously, as the offense has sputtered, they've changed things. But initially, they were much more willing to go into 11 personnel and have 3 receivers on the field. They were much more willing to go into 5-man protection. They were much more willing to go empty and have a running back in the slot or something like that. They've kind of gotten rid of some of the concepts that we saw from last year, like fewer over routes and corner routes than last year. The play action rate is significantly less than it was last year. Some of that is because the Vikings cannot credibly threaten play action when they're down by 2 scores, but some of that, I think, even in neutral situations, the Vikings play action rate is significantly down from last year. Yeah, there are elements that look a lot different. The Stefanski offense. So despite Kubiak being the older coach, the Stefanski offense last year was more old school than the Kubiak offense this year, which is a little bit more interested in motions, especially recently, a little bit more interested in what we would call analytically sound moves, like putting more receivers on the field and stuff like that. So yeah, there are some pretty significant differences. And I think the Stefanski offense in Cleveland definitely looks to me more similar to the Vikings offense last year than the Vikings offense this year does to the Vikings offense last year, which I think was that the observation that was made in the question? I watched a couple of Browns games, and it seems like that. Yes, yeah, no, yeah, okay, yeah, you're correct, Beef Brewski. We observed the same thing. So yeah, I think it is. There are significant differences in play calling, but I will say that the Brown stuff looks a lot cleaner, and it's not just the execution stuff. I think there's a bunch of really exciting parts of that offense that is not just a product of execution. Like, I mean, how many wide receiver passes did the Vikings throw last year? Like one, right? And it was Diggs, and it didn't work out very well, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
They got like Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham, which rip, I guess. But they got those guys throwing darts all over the field to each other, even.
Next question is going to be from Chris, who asks, is it possible to doom the Jets more than they currently are? And if so, what would that look like?
Jets got kind of close this week against the Bills.
Yeah, that really would have just been that would
have just been the nail in the coffin for that piece.
Yeah.
But the Jets were playing pretty well up until, relatively speaking, I should say, up until halftime. Then everyone remembered, can't be doing that.
Nope.
And so
that's not how we get rid of Adam Gase.
Yeah. So the players played for their livelihoods by playing against their jobs. Very screwed up incentive structure currently with the Jets, where everyone knows you have to get rid of Adam Gase before you can get a fair shake.
Well, I mean, you're talking about an incentive structure, and oddly enough, who is the defensive coordinator for that team?
Oh, yeah. Also, the play calling for the Jets game was way different. It was wild. Like, and Gase has been calling plays all year, and I suspect secretly that he did not call plays because it looked so different. But yeah, how do you curse the Jets more than they currently are? Jeez.
Voodoo woman named Phyllis would be my suggestion.
Well, so here's an interesting. It's going to get slightly political, but like, okay, say Trump loses the election, which 538 odds seem to indicate he will. Which that didn't go super well in 2016, but the odds are further apart than last time. Woody Johnson, I think, is still the ambassador to the UK. I want to say, the United States ambassador to the UK. He is. Obviously very good friends with President Trump, but also part owner of the Jets. And I think the primary owner of the Jets. And it's just, and Chris Johnson's the one that runs it. So in theory, Biden makes his own, ambassador nominations, which, those are always political in nature. So you get rid of Woody Johnson. He comes back. And I feel like there's a lot that can happen there with, because Woody Johnson has just made a bunch of faux pas in the UK. I feel like if he brings that back home, like there's a lot of cursed energy that has.
Like he decides he really likes Adam Gase? Yeah,
right. You can be like, Chris, brother, you're doing this all wrong. Give him a raise. There's all kinds of stuff. There's they could start serving chlorinated chicken in the.
They could start serving the roast beef that Randy Moss didn't like.
Well, no, there's a whole chlorinated chicken controversy in the UK surrounding.
That is right. I did remember reading about that. What is wrong with people? It's like this.
It's just like a food safety expert that's like listening to this podcast. Or like, no, it makes sense. It's not in the food. Come on, but no, it sounds funny, so we're rolling with it.
Yeah, to those same people, there are screenshots of Instagram people and Facebook people who are proud of cooking their chicken to like medium. So, like, I like my chicken with a pink inside. No, you don't. Let me be clear here. This is a bad way to live your life, son. Duke's Code asks the most important question of the week. Now that Ben DiNucci has ascended to the Tom Brady of our has ascended to the Tom Brady of our generation. What the hell does that even mean? How do we successfully dump Cousins and bring in Dak for 2021?
Yeah. So now that Ben DiNucci has ascended to become the Tom Brady of our generation, let's just say that.
Sure.
Which that's fair. I mean, the starting quarterback goes down, the backup quarterback goes down. Ben DiNucci / Tom Brady go into, well, Tom Brady was the primary quarterback, but or the primary backup, but same story structure. They come in initially, doesn't play that well. Tom Brady, which I guess Tom Brady's first start in 2001 was pretty horrible. Didn't work all that well. DiNucci, not a great start, fumbled the ball, got sacked twice. But it's a learning experience, get used to the speed of the game. And wouldn't you know it, the Nooch has it in him. It's going to lead the Cowboys to a Super Bowl run.
Cinderella story out of nowhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, out of James Madison. It's pretty significant somewhere, James.
I was starting to quote Caddyshack, and you did a complete no from James Madison. My Dukes.
My Dukes. So in that case, obviously, Dak becomes Drew Bledsoe, except good. That was a bit much.
That is a Heisman Award win.
Bledsoe was pretty good. But Dak becomes a supercharged Drew Bledsoe. The Vikings trade their first round pick for him because, of course, and then pay him through the nose, just like the Bills did.
It's Dallas. We could have thrown some picks in there, too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They already want to get rid of him. Actually, they probably don't franchise him in this scenario. So they just let him hit the free market. They'll grab their third round compensatory pick.
That seems like a poor choice, but
I mean, they would franchise and trade him, but who knows? The Vikings sign him for $30 million. You got to trade Cousins. Maybe he could be Ben DiNucci's backup. Kind of mentor him on. And not grilling. Can't do that.
What are you? What is he mentoring DiNucci on? Sliding.
He's pretty good with money. He doesn't spend very much of his own money. So maybe he can be like a financial advisor.
Yeah, maybe. Or being able to speak out on uncomfortable topics, or just working on a baseball slide because he could use a bit of work.
Yeah. He becomes the Sean Mannion to Ben DiNucci, the Brian Hoyer to Ben DiNucci's Tom Brady, if you will.
This is so bad.
Yeah, and Dak comes in and is ready to compete right away, and they meet each other in the playoffs. And unfortunately, Ben DiNucci wins, but yeah, the Vikings made a great go of it. Good job.
In this scenario, the Vikings also get a win against New Orleans in the playoffs for no good reason, too. So,
absolutely no reason. Yeah. You got Taysom Hill pick 6. Why did you even put him in there?
Sean, Drew, you should have retired 2 years ago. Really? This is where we're at. Christopher Wiley asks, can we put Justin Jefferson's season in historical perspective? Can we cross our fingers for an offensive rookie of the year to salvage this mess of a season?
There's no way he wins offensive rookie of the year. And that's not because he's not playing well enough for it or is not getting enough statistics. And it's not because of whatever market he's in. I don't think that has very much to do with it. I mean, it obviously plays a role. I think if there's a quarterback that's eligible for it, they'll win it. And Justin Herbert right now is playing out of his mind. So I think Justin Herbert wins it. And then also James Robinson is playing really well. There's a ton of competitors, right? CeeDee Lamb. I feel like I'm missing 3 or 4 of them, but there've been a bunch of really great rookie offense.
It's been a good rookie class this year.
Yeah. I think the best performing rookie, honestly, is Tristan Wirfs. But offensive linemen don't win it. So I think it's going to be Justin Herbert. Yeah, a crazy good rookie class this year. These rookies are playing way better than most rookie classes do. And you would think, given all the circumstances, that they would be playing way worse. It's perfectly set up for them to just fall flat in their faces.
Nope,
no offensive practices, but
balling out of control.
Just a wildly good offensive rookie class, and some of the defenders are playing pretty well too.
Yeah.
I don't think Justin Jefferson has much of a shot at offensive rookie of the year, but he's leading all rookie receivers in yardage. He's leading them all in yards per route run. So it's not like he's getting way more chances. CeeDee Lamb has now fallen pretty far behind since the past 2 games. And there was a really good Adam Harstad tweet. I'm going to pull it up right now that I'm going to link in the show notes as well. That looked at Justin Jefferson through the first 6 games of his career, and compared it to like active players and stuff like that. Terry McLaurin was the guy he was originally talking about. So he was like, Terry McLaurin through 20 career games is 21st in yardage through, or no, he's 14th in yardage through 20 career games historically. So that includes like players like Ernest Givens and Marcus Robinson and Randy Moss. But of active players, is only behind Odell Beckham, AJ Green, Juju Smith-Schuster, Julio, Michael Thomas, and Allen Robinson. So great for Terry McLaurin. He's super underrated. I think out of all the young receivers, he's getting significantly less credit than Juju Smith-Schuster, especially compared to his production. AJ Brown, DK Metcalf. I think Terry McLaurin is up there. So great. But there's questions about Justin Jefferson, and this guy did end up tweeting something about Justin Jefferson through 6 games. So historically, all receivers through 6 games, Justin Jefferson ranks second. He is only behind Anquan Boldin. He is ahead of number 3, obviously, who is Randy Moss. So actually, the most difficult part of this early streak, so Moss turned it on like weeks 12, 13 or whatever, like a little bit late in the season. But he did have a wildly good week 5 game. It was like 190 yards in week 5 in 1998. And so Justin Jefferson was beating Moss by 75 yards entering week 5, and then needed like 90 yards in order to stay ahead of him, which is kind of wild. Did so, and is now ahead of every active receiver and Randy Moss in yards through 6 games. So of those active receivers, you've got Amari Cooper, Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb still, despite these last 2 games, Julio, Odell Beckham, and Odell Beckham also turned it on pretty late, so we'll see how that goes. AJ Green, Michael Thomas, and Willie Snead, who did not end up turning out, but had some pretty good games early on. But yeah, that is your historical context. Other names on this list that are not active receivers include Andre Johnson, Joey Galloway, Michael Clayton, like some pretty good receivers. So historical context, pretty effing good. Reminder, Anquan Boldin is also on the list. Willie Snead, also on the list. Some guy named Wesley Walker on the list. He's a Jets receiver I've never heard of, so he must not have turned out to be all that great. He's no Wayne Corbett. But
but honestly, who is?
Yeah, but who is? But yeah, from a historical perspective, he's in remarkable company and ahead of everyone except Anquan Boldin, like in NFL history.
Yeah. Also, as a bolognese enthusiast, rather, what are your thoughts on Binging with Babish's most recent video on the subject?
Oh, yeah. So I watched it, and then I totally forgot about it. Then I saw this question, so I had to look up the recipe. And a couple of things stood out. One, he uses white wine instead of red wine. So that's not traditional, and we have used red wine. But I did recently watch an Adam Ragusier, I think is how you pronounce his name, video about the differences between using red wine and white wine in foods. And his argument was, not many people have tested it. They only put the wine in that they kind of want to pair with the dinner, which is an intuitive step, but not necessarily the best step, because as you heat up the wines, the tannins become more pronounced. So you end up with a sourer flavor than you want. The white wines don't have that. So in theory, that is actually a better wine to include. So I'm actually kind of curious about that step. I don't do it, but I'd be interested. He mixes the 3 meats. Typically, I don't do that only because it's just kind of a hassle to get all 3 meats. But when I do have the opportunity, I do that. He puts the milk in at like right before it goes in the oven for like 3-4 hours. I usually wait until there's about an hour left before I put the milk in. I don't know why I do that. So I don't know if that's
apparently just an Arif quirk on that. I've
I
always
think I
been
put it from a recipe, so this is probably how I do it. So.
I've always just been weirded out at the idea of putting milk in the bolognese, and I remember being weirded out all the way back from the first Matty Matheson lasagna episode when it looked like he was just pouring milk into this thing. I believe that was also the key bumps of salt
Yeah.
The origination of the key bumps of salt. But he was just pouring all this milk into it, and it turned it from red to like a grayish brown. And I was like, I really don't know about, but that people seem to have enjoyed it or just enjoyed the sheer amount of parsley he put into it. So seeing Andrew Ray binging with Babish put the milk in, it's like, okay, well, I guess I trust Andrew Ray a bit more on this subject.
Right, yeah.
Or at least
Yeah.
he's not yelling at the sound. He's not yelling over the sounds he hears in his head while he's doing his cooking show. So maybe. Speaking of which, have you watched the first episode of the second season of Just a Dash, or have you still avoided it?
Avoided makes it seem like I've gone out of my way. No, I haven't watched it yet, but I have it up in a tab right now. I just haven't gotten around to it.
The second episode is going to come out. That's either tomorrow, which is Tuesday, or Wednesday. So I might be worth watching together. But I rewatched a bunch of Maddie Matheson the other night for reasons unknown to anyone else, not even myself. But I rewatched that episode too. It's like, oh wow, you start off with a discussion on Pizzagate, and then you go right into your food, huh? All right, let's do this then. Why not? I don't know though. The bolognese it looked good, but I still question the addition of milk just because I have problems, I guess. Damian Barrett asks, question for Arif's dating corner. I fear I am in an abusive relationship. I spend hours meticulously preparing for our weekends together. I consider and reflect on things that have not worked out in the past, and yet every week, without fail, the Norse Code Fantasy League kicks me right in the crotch. Want to point out that Damian Barrett is the listener who had the streak of 3 weeks where his kicker missed an extra point and he ended up with negative 25 points, and then he had like 2 weeks off. And this week he just happened to be playing me, and then he got the negative 25 points again. It really was spectacular to see, especially because it didn't affect me. But the negative 25 did affect you.
Oh yeah. So Brandon McManus missed an extra point.
Very end of the game.
I was like, because I keep rostering him because he's had the fewest missed extra points, and I didn't expect the Denver offense to do very well, so he had very few opportunities. He's only missed like 1 extra point in the last 3 years. So not a ton of opportunities to miss, a very high percentage on extra points. I was like, all right, I'm going to have high Brandon McManus exposure is what they call it in fantasy. It sounds weird.
Nonsense. What you do is you pick the team with the worst record that's scoring the least touchdowns, and that's where you go. And I tried that with the Jets. I tried that with the Jets this week.
Picks. I don't know, man.
No, I tried with the Jets this week, and then I had to change it because their kicker couldn't play. Their kicker was was injured, and they had to put a replacement kicker in. And I don't even remember if that kicker was even in Yahoo at that point.
So that's funny. So this is kind of what's crazy about it. So my average point differential as a result of this, as a result of taking essentially negative 80 or negative 75 points through 3 games, right? Because it's Brandon McManus everywhere. If I was going to lose 1 week, I was going to lose them all. Was what I told myself after the fact. The average point differential was, let's see, I'm going to add that to that to that. The average point differential was 6.79. It was very small. And the reason for that is I played against somebody who also had a missed kick and barely lost to them, which sucks. You'd think that that's where a win might come from, but I lost by about 4 points to them, 4.1 points. I lost by, as you'd expect, 20 plus points against somebody else. That's the person who had a missed kick. So actually no, never mind. Yeah, so the one team that missed a kick, I lost by like 30 points to, which is crazy. They also missed a kick, and I lost by 30 points. The other 2 teams did not miss a kick, and those two teams, I lost by 4 points and won by 18 points. Like I won in one of my Brandon McManus games where they did not miss a kick.
Yeah.
So I came out 1-2 on the weekend, and the only game I lost is the one where they also missed a kick. Or not the only game, but one of the two games. Like that's wild. I had like AJ Brown and Antonio Gibson and Ryan Tannehill. I had James Robinson in one of these leagues. I ended up with the one where I ended up winning against somebody who made all their kicks. I had Robbie Anderson, AJ Brown, Devontae Adams, Antonio Gibson, and James Robinson on my team. So I built up a pretty good buffer.
I accidentally started 3 wide receivers for Carolina last week in one of my leagues.
Somebody was going to do all right.
I did very well for myself. That broke all of the rules of fantasy. Also, just want to point out something. I got a lot of crap from all of you. Not all of you listeners, but you and other people tweeting this out. When I selected Justin Tucker as the 12th pick overall in one of our drafts, I want to point out him in first place after this week.
Well, fantasy is dumb.
Yes.
And about that fact.
I am being rewarded for choosing Kansas City's defense. So just throwing that out there. That 24 points really did help.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go to Lifting Lightly, who asks, I'm turning to easy crock pot meals more and more during the pandemic. What is your favorite crock pot recipe, or what's your favorite crock pot meal? You tend to be more of the or you've had more experience with the roasts and historically anyway.
Yeah, I like the roasts. Just like a beef chuck, throw that in there with a little bit of chicken broth or beef broth or wine or some combination, potatoes, carrots, sear the roast beforehand, really be aggressive about salt, obviously add all your other spices that you want as well, but you can just add that to the broth part. But yeah, set it and forget it, and it tastes really remarkable a couple hours later.
I would have you go to Google and type in Reddit and the soup. And up on the slow cooking subreddit, the soup that they talk about is fantastic. I've made a version of it. There's multiple there's multiple versions of it. Google it's basically a chicken tortellini, or it's a tortellini with cheese, with chicken and chicken broth and a couple other things, tomatoes in it as well. It is delicious, fantastic, well worth the time that it ends up taking to make, and it is fairly easy to do in the crock pot world. It doesn't even really make you create a roux or anything either. There's a little bit of microwaving you end up doing to kind of help things along, but that's about it. So Reddit and the soup, it is fantastic. I highly recommend it. Don from Ohio asks the 2 final questions this week. Don from Ohio asks, Dear Arif, I mentioned how I was dominating in a fantasy football league outside of Norse Code. You insinuated that the people I play with know nothing of football. Those people include Ryan Bozer, Miles Gorham, Matt Anderson, and Eric Thompson, just to name a few. Would you care to retract your statement?
Absolutely not.
Here comes the double down.
You say, if they're losing to you, Don, pretty clear they don't know much about football. I regret having Eric replace me on Norse Code this last week.
Or the machine, you mean?
Right, on the machine, of course. We would never replace Norse Code. Yeah, on the machine. I mean, I would just reschedule Norse Code. That's the difference. Sorry. It's a little bit easier to reschedule Norse Code than the machine as part of it.
By God, it's Eric Thompson's music. Here he comes.
No, I regret it. I think he picked for me. I think he went 1 and 2 in my Vegas picks, which is very regrettable because of the lead that Luke has. Somehow,
in defiance of God's will, let's just be honest.
Right. Right, because I got Rams plus 5.5. I don't know what else. Oh, it was 2-1. I think because I got the over in Patriots, whatever. Patriots Raiders. That might have been, or Bucks Raiders? Yeah, whatever.
Did you
Tom
see
Brady.
Dusty hit his his 6-team teaser?
No? Is he sending us any of that money?
I think he should. He had posted his parlay of Saints, Bills, Packers, Buccaneers, Chiefs, and Chargers.
Wow.
That's that is quite the parlay there.
Yeah.
Also from Don from Ohio, there was a lot of discussion this today about this terrible new pellet grill that he picked up, to the point where other of his friends,
Roasted. Unlike his food.
I remember texting Dusty halfway through today and being like, I didn't necessarily mean to jump off the top rope Randy Savage style on him, but that's kind of what ended up happening. He said, "Dear haters, I've decided to be the bigger man and allow each of you to decide which meat I shall cook on my new wood pallet smoker/grill. What is your choice? P.S. I will be marinating said meat with James's tears I have saved from his embarrassing loss to me in fantasy in 2017. It goes to show that Don really doesn't pay attention to fantasy stuff, since he beat me this week but didn't mention it here." So just to tie that in with the prior question,
Incredible.
so, and this is, I got it up here.
Phenomenal.
I was actually really upset I was going to lose, but I was like, well, I pulled 3 games out of my butt this week. I'm not going to question it. So the meat that he should that he should cook. So this has to be like a turkey thing, right?
I don't. That doesn't like. If it turns out bad, you know, you'll all just blame the pellet thing, and Donald will be like, "You set me up. It's a turkey." I want something like definitive. I want like a brisket, right? It's hard to screw up, but if you're not smoking it, it's going to come out way differently. So if this truly isn't very good at smoking meats, you're going to be able to taste the difference right away. So I think it's a brisket.
I would go with something like a brisket or a Boston butt, simply because the main reason why you should have something like this is because it's easy to control the heat over long periods of time. It's kind of the reason why, not kind of, it is the reason why people move away from something like a stick burner, which is what I have, and into an outdoor oven, which is what this is. It is incredibly annoying after 3.5, 4 hours to have to light up a whole new set of coals in order to make sure that you make it through that last hour and a half on a Boston butt outside for a stick burner. That said, I tend to like the taste a little bit better from that than a different type of smoker. So if you are going to do something like this, you're better off doing a longer cook. You're better off doing a piece of meat that requires a longer period of time. But because brisket tends to be a much higher it tends to be like a higher difficulty, I would go with a pork shoulder or a Boston butt sort of thing. And it's a lot easier to do. It's really just about putting on your binder. Some people use mustard for this. I tend to use mustard, and then putting on your rub, and then bringing that up to about 275. You're obviously, with something like what you have, you can just dial that in right away. It doesn't require any effort, doesn't require any skill, doesn't require any like placement of coals, or whether or not you're using like a snake method in a different type of grill or something. Or in my situation, kind of choosing which type of meat, and if you have the wood a little bit like drier, like I tend to use a mixture of hickory and apple for this particular type of wood. I don't know if that's going to mess it, if you can get those pellets rather combined immediately, or if you have to, actually go in and do this and, you mix up your pellets properly. So I would go 275 on the pork shoulder. You actually don't need you don't have to wrap it up immediately or put anything under it. You can actually just put that on the grate, fat side down. 275 after you cover that thing in your rub of choice. I tend to go with Killer Hogs barbecue, but do whatever you need. So 275, I do hickory and cherry or hickory and apple rather. You can put, see, the instructions I'm kind of reading off of at the moment include putting an onion on the fire. Well, you don't have a fire to put it on. So that kind of ruins that. But what you do is about every half hour to an hour, you would do a spritz of red wine vinegar and water onto the meat to kind of help color it up and help keep it moist. So you would use a spritz bottle for that, and then I would wrap it after about 2.5 hours or so. Yeah, about 2.5, 3 hours. Make sure you wrap that up. You can put your temperature probe in there and just make sure you bring it up to the proper temperature. But you're going to want to use a couple of layers of aluminum foil in order to do that. Arif will have the description for this Boston butt in the show notes. I highly recommend it. This is the recipe I use. It is fantastic. You don't necessarily have to do the apricot barbecue glaze with it, but it is fantastic. And I usually just end up choosing a barbecue sauce that I like, maybe thin it out with a little red wine vinegar or something. So I do that. I cook it up to about 198, and then I take I do a little bit of barbecue sauce on it. So I like it. It's quite good. And then you can just pull that thing into sandwiches or nachos or whatever you're going to end up using it for. But yeah, I would do that instead of.
So you're saying the Boston butt is smarter to do right away?
I would say that because you can get your chops in. You can kind of figure out how this is going to. It's really hard to mess this up. If you're
afraid to compete, do the Boston butt. If you're if you're willing to throw down, brisket.
If you're gonna do brisket, do a flat or something. Like and brisket's more expensive than pork shoulder, so you're just gonna be
no brisket.
I do find myself speaking in Southern terms or like Southern quotes when I'm doing barbecue stuff. Like if one of the kids wants to take a look at what I'm doing in the smoker, I'll say something like, "If you're looking, it ain't cooking." And I'll have to stop and go, "Oh God, did I just do that?" But anyway, I would suggest doing this as a good test. I remember when I first got the smoker together, the first thing I did was a chicken thing, and I ruined it horribly because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Also, not a bad thing to test on because chicken is relatively inexpensive as opposed to a brisket that can actually send you back. But I would suggest this, and good luck making your future wife happy because she's already declared that she prefers the taste of charcoal and everything. So good luck convincing her. Yeah, good luck convincing her that this is how it's supposed to be and that you are a appropriate person that she should spend the rest of your life with. Because you clearly make poor choices. Even in your Twitter mentions, people were saying that the thing you picked up was terrible.
Just incredible. Absolutely demolished.
Throwing that out there. Anyway, I would suggest a Boston butt. It's pretty hard to mess it up, and it kind of gives you a good idea of what your smoker is capable of. Now, I can't wait for Don to just laugh his butt off when I finally do succumb to the world of pellet smokers and being like, I know it's like having an oven outside, but guys, listen, these are the positives of it. Like, I can't wait for me to finally just accept my hypocrisy and do this. But for right now,
you're on this path, that's for sure.
I am young and idealistic, or at least I am younger and more idealistic than Dawn, and I am gonna stick to this for as long as I can until I just lose my mind, throw the smoker out into the street, and go over to the nearest Menards and pick up a pellet grill and just being like, it's so much easier, guys. It doesn't require any skill or effort. I can see why Don liked it. Boy, I don't think I could go any further on that. Arif, where can people find your work?
Yeah, you can find me at theathletic.com/author/Arif-Hassan. I believe the $1 a month promotion has ended, sadly, but from my understanding, there's still like a promotion, which I don't know what the thing is, but it's, I think, more than the 40% off that you often get as a first-time subscriber. So head over there if you haven't signed up already. Be sure to click on one of my articles so that I get credit for it. I love getting credit for stuff, but also it helps pay me. So head over there. I'm going to be writing that piece I mentioned about trading Adam Thielen and Harrison Smith. And then obviously I've got my players of the week, which actually, because the Vikings were on bye, I actually finished early. I finished right before we recorded the show. So I might be able to get that up earlier than usual.
I'm willing to bet that no Bears ended up in that list.
No, I think Khalil Mack did.
Oh.
Yeah, but that's it.
I was going to say, was that
Johnson had a pretty good game? But like, come on.
Was that before or after he got hurt?
Before.
Yeah.
But he was having a pretty good game, and there was not a ton of great edge defenders. I'm really glad Aaron Donald didn't just play out of his mind, but played even better than he typically does, because I was running real low on interior defender. It was a bad week for interior defenders because the ones that got a bunch of pressures got like blown up in the run game and stuff like that. So Aaron Donald capping off the week was great. Also because of all the stuff that was happening about Aaron Donald on the timeline today.
It seems to be it's almost like sports writers want to pick up the challenge of like discrediting Aaron Donald, and then Aaron Donald just comes out like,
yeah, and then that game he like has the game of his life.
Yeah,
which for him is just like monstrous.
It's almost like Carson Wentz asking or saying, "Why doesn't Arif like me? I don't." What does he have against me?
I don't get it. Do you know why?
Exactly. All right. Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We will be back later this week with the preview of the game for Sunday. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember to always bring your wine towel. And we'll be back later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's official Vikings blog, at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. You can also find his written work at theathletic.com. I am your podcast host and producer, and my name is James Bagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at BigMono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can make a recurring monthly contribution by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. A donation of $3.50 per month does get you bonus material from the show and much more. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.